I came back to visit my wife without any warning. There she was asleep on the doormat, dressed in raggedy old clothes. My son-in-law wiped his shoes on her and told the guests she was the crazy maid. I did not scream. I stepped forward, and the entire room went still at what I said next. Welcome to Family Revenge Stories, where real betrayal meets real justice, and the truth always finds its way to the surface. If a story like this one speaks to you, go ahead and tap subscribe, so the next one comes straight to you. Before we begin, I want to ask you something simple. When someone close to you lets you down in a serious way, do you tend to forgive and move forward, or do you believe some betrayals are simply beyond repair? Drop your answer in the comments. I read every single one. One quick note. Some details in this story have been shaped for storytelling purposes, and any resemblance to specific real people or events is purely coincidental. What matters is the truth at the heart of it. It was for my daughter Lacey and her husband Clifford. They needed a hand up. They needed a starting point. I gave them mine, taking a punishing contract thousands of miles from home, leaving my wife Patty to enjoy her later years in the comfort of the house I was grinding myself down to pay for. I stepped out of the cab into the sharp Connecticut night air, my canvas kit bag slung over my shoulder. I hadn't breathed a word about coming. It was meant to be a surprise for Patty's birthday. I made my way up the neatly trimmed driveway. High-end cars sat bumper to bumper along the street. Porsches, imported sedans, luxury SUVs. Through the wide bay windows, chandelier light poured warm and gold over men in tailored suits holding champagne flutes. A full-blown party was underway inside. I let myself smile, figuring Clifford's tech startup had finally caught traction, that my financial bleeding had meant something. I reached the walnut front door and pressed my nickel key into the lock. It wouldn't turn. I worked it back and forth. The cylinder was wrong, entirely replaced. New locks, a cold knot cinched tight in my gut. I didn't touch the doorbell. I circled the outside of the house, past the shaped hedges around to the side service door. I'd hung that solid oak frame myself 5 years back. I knew exactly where the latch bound up. I leaned my shoulder into the wood, found the hidden pressure point, and slid inside. The service hall was pitch black, opening into the mudroom beyond. I moved without sound, the thumping bass of the party vibrating up through the floorboards. I took a step toward the inner door, and my boot found something soft on the ground. A sharp gasp cut through the darkness. I dropped straight to my knees, hands sweeping the floor blind until my fingers met a thin, trembling shoulder. I pulled out my phone and switched on the flashlight. The air went out of me in a single violent rush. It was Patty. My wife of 45 years was curled up on a dirty dog mat. She had on a filthy, oversized t-shirt that reeked of damp mold and urine. Her cheekbones jutted out like ridgelines. Her hair was tangled and matted flat. She looked up into the beam, blinking her eyes glassy and frightened. Her cracked lips parted, but before she could make sense of my face, the inner door handle rattled. I killed the light and pressed back into the shadow of the heavy winter coats hanging there. The door swung wide, throwing a wedge of golden light across the mudroom floor. Clifford walked in, guiding two well-heeled men in expensive suits. He laughed a smooth, rehearsed sound as he turned to face them. He never looked down. Without a glance, he scraped the mud from his patent leather Oxfords directly onto the edge of Patty's thin blanket. She flinched, drawing her knees tight to her chest. One of the investors glanced down, frowning at the frail woman shivering on the floor. Clifford dismissed it with a lazy wave. "Don't mind her, gentlemen," he said, perfectly even. "That's our housekeeper, a bit touched. Severe dementia, but she works for room and board, keeps her off the streets." The investors gave uneasy laughs and steered their attention back toward the pitch. I did not scream. I did not shatter into blind rage. Up in Alaska, you learn fast that panic will finish you quicker than the cold ever will. You stay alive by turning your blood to ice. I stepped out of the shadows. The sudden movement caught the investors off guard. Clifford spun around, that practiced smirk locking up instantly on his face. The color left his cheeks in one clean pull, leaving him looking hollow. I fixed my gaze on the two investors, my voice dropping to a low, controlled rasp that carried off the tile. I told them I was sorry for my wife's condition, that her son-in-law had simply neglected to mention she holds the deed to the floor he was currently wiping his shoes on. The mudroom went absolutely silent. Both investors stared at Clifford with undisguised horror, champagne trembling in their glasses. Clifford's mouth worked stammering, trying desperately to hold his $1 million image together. Vernon, he choked out, forcing a frantic, hollow laugh. Vernon, what are you doing here? Come outside, I can explain all of this. He reached out and grabbed my arm, trying to muscle me toward the back door away from his guests. His hand clamped hard onto my bicep. I didn't hesitate. I shifted my weight, seized his wrist, and drove it downward with the same brutal, mechanical leverage I used working cargo chains. Clifford let out a sharp cry, his knees buckling at once. He went down to the floor, gasping right there beside the mat where my wife lay. I let go and dropped beside Patty. I gathered her up into my arms. She was nearly weightless, like lifting something hollow. She pressed her face into my jacket, her fingers clutching my shirt. He took my phone, Vern, she whispered, her voice fracturing. He took everything. I got to my feet with my wife held against my chest, walked straight past the stunned investors, and shouldered the service door open. Behind me, Clifford clambered upright, cradling his bruised wrist. You can't take her, he shouted from the porch, voice cracking apart. I have medical power of attorney. You're an estranged intruder. I'll call the police and have you charged with kidnapping. I didn't look back. I walked my wife down the driveway, past the luxury cars and the pale faces watching from the windows, and set her gently in the back of my waiting cab. Drive, I told the driver. Don't stop until we reach the emergency room at the private hospital downtown. The ride dissolved into a blur of passing streetlights and Patty's shallow, labored breathing. I kept hold of her hand, feeling the brittle bones through her paper-thin skin. How had I not seen it? Every Sunday I'd called the house. Clifford or Lacey always answered, bright and easy. Patty was resting or out in the garden or off with friends. They had built a fortress of lies, and I had paid for every brick. I carried her through the sliding glass doors of the emergency room and demanded immediate attention. I registered her under my mother's maiden name, a borrowed alias to buy us time. The triage nurses took one look at her emaciated frame and moved her behind the curtains without a word. I paced the waiting room, my mind methodically sorting through every detail, every wire transfer, every legal document I'd signed over to my daughter and her husband. 2 hours later, the attending physician brought me into a small side room. He was a stern man, dark circles heavy under his eyes. He studied me with a mix of clinical concern and hard suspicion. Your wife does not have dementia, he said, his tone flat and deliberate. Her cognitive impairment is entirely chemical. She's suffering from severe, prolonged malnutrition. Then came the part that landed like a fist. They'd found dangerously elevated levels of unprescribed sedatives in her bloodstream. Someone had been deliberately keeping her sedated and starved. A cold, settled fury took hold in my chest. Clifford hadn't simply neglected her. He had methodically poisoned her to keep her trapped in that mudroom, torturing her to maintain his grip on my assets. I was about to press the doctor for a full toxicology report when a disturbance at the front desk cut us short. I stepped out of the room. 2 police officers in full tactical gear stood at the triage counter, hands resting on their utility belts. They were showing the nurse a photograph. It was a photograph of me. We have an active Amber Alert, the taller officer announced, his voice filling the waiting room. A dangerous, estranged individual just abducted a mentally unfit senior citizen from her legal guardian in Greenwich. We have reason to believe she is in immediate danger. The nurse raised a trembling finger and pointed it straight at me. The officers turned hands, going to their radios. The escape from the mudroom had spawned something far more dangerous in its place. I was no longer just a betrayed father. I was a wanted fugitive, standing between my poisoned wife and the man working to bury us both under the law. I planted myself between the 2 officers and the curtain sheltering Patty. My pulse hammered against my ribs, but when I spoke, my voice came out dangerously quiet. I told them they were not taking her. The taller officer squared his jaw and rested his hand on his radio. He told me to step aside, said I was obstructing a medical kidnapping investigation, that the legal guardian had every right to take custody of his mother-in-law. I didn't move. I asked him whether he'd actually read the report Clifford filed, or simply taken the word of a man in an expensive suit at face value. I had told them to pull the property deed on that house in Greenwich, to look at whose name was on the title. It wasn't Clifford's. It was Vernon and Patty. I wasn't an estranged intruder. I was the homeowner, and the woman behind that curtain was my wife of 45 years. The second officer's expression shifted, thrown by how completely unafraid I was. He asked for my identification. I reached into my coat pocket slowly and deliberately, knowing that any sudden move could put me in handcuffs before I could finish a sentence. But before my fingers could close around my wallet, the emergency room doors burst open with a violent hiss. Clifford came striding into the waiting area, playing the part of the distraught, devoted family man to perfection. And right behind him walked Lacey, my daughter, the little girl I had spent 2 freezing years up in Kodiak, Alaska, grinding away to support, the girl whose extravagant wedding I had paid for in cash. She was wearing a wool overcoat I recognized immediately because I had wired the money for it last Christmas. She didn't run to me. She didn't push past the officers to ask how her mother was holding up. Instead, she stayed planted behind her husband's shoulder, her eyes moving everywhere except toward my face. Clifford thrust a finger in my direction at once, his voice pitching into a perfectly rehearsed, trembling performance. He told the officers I was the man they were looking for. He claimed I was the one who broke into their home and dragged a gravely ill woman out into the cold night. He insisted I was dangerously unstable and needed to be detained before I caused her further harm. I shut Clifford out entirely. I looked straight at my daughter. I said her name, cut it right through the antiseptic hum of the hospital lobby. I told her to look at me. She flinched. She gripped the lapels of her coat and fixed her gaze on the linoleum floor. Her voice came out rehearsed and hollow as she murmured that her mom was sick. She told me I didn't grasp how far things had deteriorated. She claimed Patty was violent, that she hallucinated that she attacked the staff. She told me Clifford had to move her into the mudroom for her own protection because she kept trying to wander into traffic. She begged me not to disrupt the care arrangement they had put in place. The room felt like it tilted on its axis. The fluorescent lights above seemed to flare suddenly unbearable. She is violent. She attacks the staff. My Patty, a retired school librarian, who used to weep if she accidentally stepped on a garden snail, was being described like a dangerous animal, and my own daughter was the one painting that picture. I studied Lacey's face, looking for a crack, a single tear, any sign she was being pressured or threatened. Into this. There was nothing there. What I found instead was the cold, deliberate protection of everything she'd built for herself. She knew. She knew her mother had been sleeping on a dog mat. She knew Clifford had been sedating her with unprescribed drugs. She knew all of it and had accepted it as the cost of keeping her luxury cars and her country club table. That weight of betrayal was physical. It crushed something in me, ground down the last of the man who had boarded that plane to Alaska 2 years earlier. That man was gone right there in that emergency room. The taller officer moved closer and unclipped his handcuffs. He told me my daughter was corroborating the Guardian's report. He ordered me to turn around, hands behind my back. They were returning the patient to her legal residence. I didn't raise my hands. Instead, I drew my wallet from my coat and flipped it open. What I handed them was not a standard driver's license. It was my federal logistics clearance, a solid government-issued card bearing a Level 4 security classification from the Department of Defense, required for overseeing frozen supply chains at the far edge of the continent. The officer took it, his eyes moving across the holograms and federal seals. The certainty on his face began to slip. I told him to read the clearance carefully, keeping my voice loud enough that Clifford could catch every syllable. I explained that I managed sovereign supply networks. I underwent rigorous psychological and financial background checks every 6 months. I told them I was not an estranged, violent intruder. I was a federally vetted contractor, and I was formally declaring that the man standing behind them had been chemically restraining my wife in order to steal my estate. I warned them that if they removed her from this hospital without a court order, I wouldn't merely sue their precinct. I would have the Federal Oversight Board dismantling their badges by morning. The 2 officers traded a long, uneasy look. Clifford pushed forward, face burning with panicked fury. He told them the ID meant nothing, that I was just an overpaid truck driver who had walked out on his family. He demanded they do their jobs and put me in cuffs right now. The taller officer handed my credentials back. Every trace of authority had drained from his posture. He looked from Clifford to me, visibly calculating the danger of going up against a man carrying the government's backing. He announced at last that this was a civil matter, his voice drawn tight. He stated they weren't pulling a sick woman out of a hospital bed tonight, but he leveled a hard finger at my chest. He was giving me exactly 24 hours. If I couldn't produce a judge's injunction voiding Clifford's medical power of attorney, by this time tomorrow, she'd be returned to her legal guardian. And if I attempted to move her from the hospital before then, he'd arrest me personally. The officers turned and walked out, leaving that deadline hanging in the air like a blade. Clifford straightened his cuffs with a smirk, his confidence flooding back now that he knew the clock was running. He mocked me, asked if I thought a plastic card changed a single thing. He laughed about the 24-hour window, telling me I'd never find a lawyer who could unwind a signed proxy in one day. He told me to enjoy my last visit and promised that tomorrow Patty was going home with him and I was headed back to the ice. He pivoted on his heel and walked straight out through the sliding glass doors. Lacey followed a beautiful shadow, never once glancing back to see whether I was standing or broken. I stood alone in the corridor, the countdown already ringing in my skull. One day to tear down an entire architecture of lies. I walked back into Patty's room, pulled my laptop from my bag, and opened it. It was time to make a call. The steady beep of the heart monitor was the only sound in that sterile room. I sat beside Patty, watching her chest rise and fall in shallow rhythms beneath the thin hospital blanket. There was no time to grieve the years I had lost with her. The police had given me exactly 24 hours to put legal documentation in front of them, proof that I had the right to protect my own wife. I opened the laptop on the small plastic tray table and dialed a number I hadn't touched since I signed my last logistics contract 2 years prior. Conrad answered on the second ring. He was a corporate attorney who treated the law not as a profession but as a contact sport. We had spent decades together navigating the brutal underbelly of international shipping contracts. He was the only man alive I trusted to tear through a wall of deception this thick. I gave Conrad the full account of what had happened in that mudroom. No embellishment, just the raw, hard facts. The changed locks, the dog mat, the sedatives in her blood, the Amber Alert. Clifford had filed against me. Conrad offered no hollow comfort. He asked for my social security number, Patty's details, and the address of the Greenwich estate. I heard his keyboard firing rapidly over the line. He told me to give him 5 minutes, his voice dropping a full octave. He said he was pulling the financial history on my son-in-law right now. I sat watching Patty's bruised wrists while I waited. For 24 months, I had been half frozen on an Alaskan supply dock, sleeping in a cramped bunk, wiring $15,000 on the first of every single month. That money was meant to cover the property taxes, maintenance costs, and Patty's medical needs. I had taken that brutal overseas contract specifically because Clifford told me his tech startup was going through a temporary cash flow crisis. He had looked me square in the eye and said he just needed a little help keeping a roof over my daughter's head. Conrad came back on the line. The typing had stopped. He asked me to confirm the amount I had been sending home. I told him $15,000 a month. Conrad let out a sharp breath. He told me Clifford had intercepted every single transfer. Not $1 had reached the household accounts. Clifford had routed the funds through a shell company straight into his failing startup. He had been burning the money I bled for in the snow to lease luxury cars and stage lavish investor parties. A deep-settled fury took root in my chest. Clifford hadn't simply failed my wife. He had deliberately starved and sedated her to keep her confined to that mudroom while living like royalty on my earnings. But Conrad wasn't done. He told me to brace myself because the stolen transfers were only the start. He had run a shadow audit on the Greenwich property deed. What he found was that Clifford had used a forged signature from Patty to secure a $3 million collateral loan against my mansion. The breath left my body. I asked how that was even legally possible. Conrad explained that Clifford had leveraged the fraudulent medical power of attorney, convinced the bank that Patty was mentally unfit, and that he was acting as her legal proxy. He had borrowed against the home I built to prop up his sinking business. Patty stirred on the bed, eyelids fluttering open as the sedatives gradually released their hold on her mind. She reached out with a trembling hand and caught my sleeve. She told me everything in a broken whisper, the full shape of the horror. She said she had found the bank notices 3 months ago. She had confronted Clifford directly about the forged $3 million loan. That was the day he put her in the mudroom. That was the day the heavy sedatives began. And the worst of it, she told me Lacey knew. My daughter had stood in the hallway watching Clifford throw the deadbolt and told her own mother to simply endure it so they wouldn't go under financially. My daughter had handed her mother over to a chemical prison. She had watched Clifford destroy the woman who raised her and accepted it as the cost of keeping her lifestyle intact. The weight of that betrayal was physical. It crushed the last remnants of the man who had stepped onto a plane bound for Alaska 2 years ago. That man was gone right there in that hospital room. I turned to the vital monitors ticking beside the bed and asked Conrad what our timeline looked like. Conrad told me that Clifford's investors from the dinner party were finalizing a $5 million buyout the next morning. He warned me that once the ink dried on that contract, Clifford would have enough liquid cash to leave the country or bury me under years of litigation. He could use those millions to legitimize the forged medical proxy and have Patty locked away in a state facilities permanently. I thanked Conrad and shut the laptop. Panic never came. The cold mechanical logic of the supply dock had taken full control. Clifford thought he had outmaneuvered a worn-out old man. He had forgotten that logistics is entirely about leverage, and I was about to pull the one support beam that held up his entire operation. I looked at the armed security guard I had posted outside the hospital room and told him nobody got through that door, especially anyone claiming to be family. I checked my watch. The investors were meeting Clifford at sunrise. That gave me exactly 9 hours to get inside my own house, recover the original forged documents, and dismantle my son-in-law's scheme before he could finish burying my wife. The rhythm of the heart monitor had settled into a calm, steady beat as the chemical fog slowly cleared from Patty's mind. I sat motionless beside the hospital bed, watching her eyelids fight against the harsh, fluorescent glare overhead. Hours had passed since I carried her out of that freezing mudroom. I waited with the deep, practiced patience I had built on the frozen docks of Alaska. I knew that pressing her too soon would only stir the anxiety Clifford had so deliberately planted. Her eyes opened fully. The cloudiness was gone. The sharp, clear woman I had married 45 years ago looked back at me from those eyes. She turned her head and extended her frail hand. I took it carefully between my roughened palms. She squeezed my fingers with a grip that surprised me with its strength. She told me she had believed I was never coming. I kept my voice low and level. I told her I was right there beside her, and that I was not going anywhere again. Then I asked her to walk me through exactly what had happened inside our home. Patty swallowed and turned her eyes to the ceiling above her. What she told me over the next few minutes demolished whatever illusions I had managed to hold on to about my family. The betrayal had started precisely 3 months earlier. She had been searching for a misplaced tax document in Clifford's home office. She opened the bottom desk drawer and found a bundle of certified bank notices, default warnings on a $3 million collateral loan secured entirely against the deed to our Greenwich estate. She recognized her own signature at the bottom of the promissory note. It was a flawless forgery. She confronted Clifford the moment he stepped through the door that evening and demanded he explain why he had stolen the equity from the home we had spent our entire lives paying for. Clifford didn't apologize. He didn't plead. Patty said his eyes simply went flat and dead. He took her by the arm, dragged her down the hallway to the mudroom, shoved her inside, and threw the deadbolt. The physical abuse was terrible, but the psychological cruelty ran deeper. Patty wept as she described how Clifford brought her a glass of water that first night. It tasted bitter and chalky. Within 20 minutes, she could barely hold her eyes open. She lost the ability to stand or put a sentence together. Clifford kept her in that chemical haze, feeding her just enough laced broth to keep her alive while he worked to finalize his fraudulent financial moves. I asked the question that had been burning through my chest the entire time. I asked her where Lacey was when all of this began. Patty closed her eyes and a single tear traced the hollow of her cheek. She told me Lacey had been standing right there in the kitchen when Clifford dragged her down the hall. My daughter had watched the man she married lock her mother in a freezing utility room. Patty said she had managed to stay conscious long enough the following morning to beg Lacey for help. Through the crack beneath the door, pleaded with her to call the police, or at least reach me in Alaska. Lacey refused. Patty recounted the exact words our daughter spoke. Lacey knelt down by the door and told her mother to just endure it so they wouldn't go bankrupt. She said Clifford just needed a bit more time to close his big investor deal. She surrendered her own mother to a chemical prison to hold on to her country club memberships and her imported cars. I sat with the full weight of that rot settling inside me, the rot that had worked its way into my bloodline. I didn't shed a tear. Grief is a luxury reserved for people who aren't in the middle of a war. I promised Patty she was safe. I told her no one would ever lock her away again. My laptop chimed sharply from the small plastic tray table, a direct incoming video call from Conrad. I moved away from the bed and picked up. Conrad was at his high-rise office city skyline stretched behind him. His tie was gone collar open. I recognized that look immediately. It meant he had found the kill shot, and it also meant we had almost no time left. Conrad skipped any greeting. He told me the situation was far more serious than a straightforward bank fraud. He had traced the investor group from Clifford's dinner party, a major venture capital firm, looking to acquire Clifford's tech startup outright. Clifford wasn't simply trying to stay above water. He was cashing out the entire fraudulent operation for a lump sum of $5 million. I asked him when the deal was set to close. Conrad leaned into his webcam and delivered the blow. The buyout was scheduled for tomorrow morning at 9:00. The venture capital firm had reserved a private boardroom downtown to sign the final paperwork. Conrad laid out the brutal arithmetic of where we stood. The moment Clifford signed that contract, the funds would land in an offshore account instantly. He'd have enough liquid cash to be out of the country by noon, and even if he stayed, $5 million would buy him a wall of defense attorneys. He could drag the forgery case out for a decade, bury me in endless litigation while the bank moved to foreclose on our home. The 24-hour window the police had offered me to produce legal documents had just become a luxury I didn't possess. We had fewer than 14 hours before Clifford locked in his escape. Conrad asked me what I wanted to do. He said we could attempt an emergency injunction to freeze the sale, but no judge would sign off on it in the middle of the night on the basis of a hospital toxicology report alone. We needed the original forged promissory note. We needed the physical evidence of the fraud in hand to put in front of those investors before the money changed hands. I glanced back at Patty sleeping quietly now that her nightmare had finally begun to lift. I thought about Clifford casually scraping his shoes clean on her blanket. I thought about Lacey telling her mother to endure the torture for the sake of a sports car. They believed they had trapped an old man who knew nothing but hard work and silence. What they forgot is that years on a remote logistics dock teach you exactly how to dismantle a failing structure before it comes down on your head. I turned my focus back to Conrad. I told him to draft the acceleration clause on the original seed money I had given Clifford years ago. I told him to have his sharpest forensic accountant standing by at dawn. Conrad warned me that going back into my own house while a desperate man occupied it carried serious risk. If Clifford found me inside, he could claim legal self-defense against an intruder. I shut the laptop before he could finish the warning. Risk wasn't the concern anymore. The time for working in the shadows had run out. I was going to recover the original forged documents from Clifford's safe. Then I was going to walk straight into that luxury boardroom tomorrow morning and reduce everything he'd built to ash. I sat in the sterile quiet of the hospital room, watching the slow, steady rise and fall of Patty's chest beneath the thin cotton blanket. The armed private security guard I'd brought in was stationed just outside the door, an immovable barrier against anyone arriving to assert medical guardianship. There was no time to sit and hold her hand. The police had handed me a hard 24-hour deadline to produce documentation proving Clifford's fraud, or they'd return my wife to her abuser. I opened the laptop on the small plastic tray table and dialed a number I hadn't touched since signing my final logistics contract in Alaska. Conrad picked up on the second ring. He was a ruthless corporate attorney, a man who treated international law as a contact sport, and my oldest friend. No pleasantries. I laid out everything: the changed locks, the dog mat in the mudroom, the unprescribed sedatives in Patty's blood, and the Amber Alert Clifford had turned into a weapon against me. Conrad skipped the sympathy. He asked for Clifford's full legal name, my social security number, and the address of the Greenwich estate. I heard the rapid, hard clatter of his keyboard come through the line. He told me to give him 5 minutes, his voice dropping to a low, deliberate register as he kicked off a preliminary shadow audit on my son-in-law. While I waited, Patty stirred on the bed eyelids, fluttering, fighting against the chemical weight Clifford had forced on her. She turned her head my way, her gaze slowly sharpening. The confusion fell away, replaced by a heartbreaking clarity. She reached out with a bruised, fragile hand and gripped my sleeve. I leaned in close, keeping my voice soft, telling her she was safe and that I wasn't leaving again. She told me everything in a broken whisper. 3 months back, she had been hunting for a misplaced utility bill in Clifford's home office. She opened a locked drawer and found a bundle of certified bank notices, default warnings on a $3 million collateral loan secured entirely against the deed to the home I had spent my life paying for. She saw her own signature at the bottom of the promissory note. A blatant forgery. Patty told me she confronted Clifford the moment he came through the door that evening. He didn't apologize. He didn't explain. She said his eyes just went dead. He seized her by the arm, hauled her down the hall, shoved her into the mudroom, and drove the deadbolt home. That was the day the heavy sedatives began. He kept her docile on laced broth, just enough to keep her alive while he finished executing his financial crimes. I asked where Lacey was when the abuse started. Patty shut her eyes, tears sliding onto the hospital pillow. She told me our daughter had been standing right there in the kitchen. Lacey watched Clifford lock her mother inside a freezing closet. Patty said she had begged Lacey through the gap at the bottom of the door, begged her to call the police, to call me in Alaska, to do anything at all. Lacey had simply knelt by the door and told her mother to just endure it so they wouldn't go bankrupt. My own daughter had chosen comfort over her mother's survival. Conrad came back on the line, the typing stopping cold. He told me the picture was far darker than a straightforward elder abuse case. He explained that Clifford had intercepted every single $15,000 wire I sent home from the Arctic. Not a dollar went to property taxes or Patty's care. Clifford funneled it through a shell company to keep his failing startup breathing. On top of that, Conrad had identified the investor group from the dinner party, a major venture capital firm moving to finalize a $5 million buyout of Clifford's company. Conrad laid out the brutal reality of our timeline. The investors were meeting Clifford in a private downtown boardroom tomorrow morning at 9:00 to execute the final contracts. Once that paper was signed, Clifford would have $5 million in liquid cash on hand, enough to flee the jurisdiction entirely or hire a full legal army to legitimize his forged medical proxy and drown me in litigation for years. The 24-hour window the police gave me was already a fiction. We had fewer than 14 hours before Clifford locked in his victory. I thanked Conrad and closed the laptop. I instructed him to draft the acceleration clause on the initial seed money I had given Clifford years ago and to have his best forensic accountant ready at dawn. I looked at Patty resting peacefully and knew I had to leave her one more time. I walked out of the hospital into the biting Connecticut night. I drove to the neighborhood and parked 3 blocks from the estate. The driveway sat empty. Clifford and Lacey were out at some upscale restaurant celebrating their coming millions. I slipped through the side service door and moved quietly through the dark, empty house. I went straight past the mudroom and into Clifford's master study. Behind a large painting on the rear wall sat a digital safe he had once been foolish enough to brag about. I pulled the painting aside and faced the keypad. Arrogant men are remarkably predictable. I entered the exact date he incorporated his startup. A green light blinked and the heavy steel door swung open. Inside was a stack of thick manila folders. The first held the original promissory note for the $3 million loan. I recognized the forged signature immediately and folded the document into my jacket. The second folder was considerably thicker, bearing the seal of a state psychiatric facility. As I read through the pages, the blood in my veins turned to ice. It was a formal expedited commitment order scheduled for the following Tuesday. Clifford had paid a corrupt private physician to fabricate a medical evaluation declaring Patty violently schizophrenic. Once the buyout cleared, he intended to have my wife committed to a state asylum for the rest of her life. I turned to the final page and found Lacey's signature authorizing the commitment. My daughter had signed her mother's life away. I moved to his desktop and inserted a high-capacity encrypted thumb drive. I got past the login screen using a diagnostic backdoor and launched a full clone of his hard drive. The progress bar crept across the screen, 15 agonizing minutes estimated. Every groan of the floorboards sounded like a car door in the driveway. I stood in the dark, watching the percentage climb, collecting the digital receipts for the illegal sedatives he had sourced offshore. At 95%, headlights swept across the front lawn. I pressed flat against the wall, heart hammering, until a delivery truck rolled past. The monitor chimed softly. I pulled the thumb drive free, secured the safe, and set the painting back in place. I slipped out the rear door into the freezing wind, my coat heavy with the evidence of everything he had done. I had the forged loan documents. I had the asylum papers. I had his entire digital life. The hunt was finished, and come morning I was going to bring a financial guillotine down on my son-in-law's neck. The early sun threw a blinding glare off the floor-to-ceiling windows of the downtown executive boardroom. 8:55. I stood in the marble corridor outside the frosted glass doors, picking up the muffled sounds of celebration drifting through. The clink of expensive porcelain, the deep, easy laughter of men convinced they were moments away from a fortune. In that room sat Clifford. My son-in-law was at the head of a massive glass table in a bespoke suit paid for with money, stolen from my wife. He was holding a silver fountain pen, hovering it inches above a contract that would deliver $5 million in liquid cash directly into his hands. He thought he had won. He thought Patty was chemically confined to a hospital bed and that I was just a spent old man who could be frightened off by a police warning. He thought he was untouchable. I glanced to my left. Conrad stood beside me. My oldest friend and corporate attorney had the look of a predator who'd caught the scent of prey. His suit was flawless, and his face held not a trace of compassion. To my right stood a man Conrad had retained a private forensic accountant, gripping a thick, heavy leather binder. That binder held the cloned hard drive data, the forged medical proxy, the fraudulent asylum commitment papers, and the original forged promissory note I'd pulled from Clifford's safe only hours before. I felt no anger. The blind rage that had nearly swallowed me whole the previous night was gone. Kodiak, Alaska had taught me to compress fury into something tight and cold and silent. I reached out and pushed the heavy oak and glass doors open. They swung wide, striking the rubber wall, stops with a dull, hollow thud that rolled across the quiet boardroom. The cheerful conversation inside cut off instantly. 5 men sat around a polished glass table. 3 were venture capitalists from the firm. The remaining 2 were the wealthy investors Clifford had brought to my mudroom the night before. At the head of the table sat Clifford, his silver pen frozen in midair. The smug, triumphant smile dropped from his face so quickly it looked as though his skin had simply given way. Every trace of color drained from his cheeks, leaving him a sickly, washed-out gray. For just a moment he stared at me, his mouth opening and closing like a fish pulled from the water. He had come here expecting to sign a paper and disappear. He had never imagined that his father-in-law's ghost would walk into his fortress. "Get out!" Clifford suddenly shouted, his voice cracking as he shoved back from his plush leather chair. A trembling finger jabbed in my direction. "Security. Someone call building security right now. This man is trespassing. He is dangerous." 2 private guards posted near the corner of the room moved forward immediately, hands going to their radios. But I kept walking. I stepped fully into the room, my boots pressing silently into the deep carpet. Conrad entered directly behind me, the accountant close at his heels. We moved at a measured, deliberate pace that carried the unmistakable weight of authority. "I am not leaving," I said. My voice was low and even, and it cut straight through Clifford's hysterical shouting like a blade through water. "I am here to address a serious financial irregularity concerning the ownership of the intellectual property you are attempting to acquire today." Clifford slammed both palms down on the glass table. "Do not listen to him," he begged the investors, his eyes wild. "He is a deranged old man. He is my father-in-law. We have been estranged for years, and he is here to extort me, because my company is finally succeeding. Guards, remove him now." The guards moved closer, reaching for my arms. But before contact was made, the lead investor from the venture capital firm raised one hand. He was one of the men from my mudroom, the man who had stood there sipping champagne while Clifford wiped the mud from his patent leather Oxfords onto my dying wife's blanket. He studied me now, eyes narrowing as recognition settled over his face. The memory of the night before moved across his expression. He remembered the cold logic in my eyes when I told him who really held title to the floor beneath his feet. He remembered the absolute terror on Clifford's face when I dropped him to his knees with a single twist of his wrist. "Hold on," the lead investor said, his voice carrying the full weight of command. He turned a cold look toward the security guards. "Nobody touches him. Step back." The guards withdrew at once, hands dropping, retreating into the edges of the room. They knew whose signature was on their checks, and it certainly was not Clifford's. Clifford looked at the lead investor as though he'd just taken a knife to the ribs. "Gentlemen, you cannot be serious," he stammered, cold sweat rising on his forehead. "We are minutes from closing a $5 million acquisition. This man has absolutely zero legal standing here. He is lying. He is trying to destroy this deal out of pure spite." The lead investor leaned back, steepling his fingers. He regarded Clifford, then he looked directly at me. "If I'm not mistaken," the investor said, his tone shifting toward something slow and dangerous, "this is the gentleman who owns the estate in Greenwich, the one whose wife you described as your dementia-riddled maid, the one you were legally obligated to care for while living under his roof." Clifford swallowed, visibly a tremor moving through him. His perfectly tailored suit seemed suddenly to hang on a smaller man. "That is a private family matter." He managed fighting to hold his professional bearing. "It has no bearing whatsoever on the valuation of my tech company or the transfer of these assets. I have every legal right to proceed with this sale today." Conrad stepped forward then. He did not raise his voice. He didn't need to. He moved to the edge of the glass table and radiated the quiet authority of a man holding the executioner's blade. "Actually," he said, addressing the room with a smooth, deliberate cadence, "that is precisely what we are here to examine. The legality of the assets you are attempting to acquire." Conrad gestured to the forensic accountant. The quiet man stepped forward, holding the thick leather binder with both hands. He said nothing. He simply walked to the center of that gleaming glass table and set it down directly in front of the $5 million contract awaiting Clifford's signature. I moved forward until I stood directly across the table from my son-in-law. He looked up at me, eyes darting in every direction, searching desperately for any way out. There was none. The doors were at my back. The investors were watching his every move. He was caged inside a trap he had built for himself. I looked down at the leather binder. It represented 2 years of my life locked away and frozen. It represented the methodical chemical torment my wife had endured in a darkened room. It represented the complete betrayal of my daughter, who had traded her mother's life for money. I did not scream. I did not overturn the table or seize him by his lapels. I simply reached out, took the heavy leather binder from the accountant, and felt the full weight of that evidence in my hands. Then I raised it and brought it down at the center of the glass table. The impact rang out like a gunshot in the silent room. The binder landed square on top of the $5 million buyout contract, covering the signature line entirely. Clifford stared at it as if it were a live explosive. His face was completely drained of color. His breathing turned shallow and rapid. He knew exactly what kind of man I was. He understood that I did not issue empty threats. If I had entered this room and placed that binder on his contract, it meant I had found his secrets. It meant I had been inside his safe. The lead investor leaned forward, studying the binder, then looked up at me. "And what exactly is this?" he asked, his tone moving from curiosity to something entirely analytical. He was a man whose first instinct was to protect his money, and he could smell something rotten in the room. "This," I said, keeping my eyes fixed on Clifford's terrified face, "is the unvarnished truth about the man sitting across from you. It is the complete forensic and legal documentation establishing that the company you are about to purchase was built entirely on stolen funds, forged signatures, and the systematic abuse of an elderly person." Clifford let out a strangled sound. He reached blindly toward the binder as if he meant to snatch it from the table, but his hands were shaking far too badly. "You cannot do this," he whispered, his voice collapsing into a pathetic plea. "Vern, please. We can talk. I can give you a percentage. We can work something out. Do not do this to me." I did not acknowledge his begging. I looked at the lead investor and placed my hand flat on the leather cover. I told the room that if they signed that contract today, they would not be acquiring a tech startup. They would be acquiring a massive criminal liability, and I would personally see to it that every single one of their venture capital funds was named as a co-conspirator in the federal wire fraud, and elder abuse lawsuits my attorney was filing in exactly 1 hour. The boardroom went completely silent. The investors looked at the binder, then they looked at Clifford, who was sinking back into his chair, a hollowed out, broken man. The destruction of his empire had officially begun. The heavy leather binder struck the glass table with a dull, resonant thud that seemed to shake the room to its bones. The silence that followed was total. It was the kind of deep, suffocating stillness that comes just before something collapses beyond recovery. The 5 men seated around that long, polished table went rigid. At the far end, Clifford sat in his high-backed leather chair, his hand trembling so badly that the expensive silver fountain pen slipped from his fingers and clattered against the glass. He had been mere seconds from signing a contract worth $5 million. Now the color had drained entirely from his face, leaving a sickly, chalky pallor behind. He stared at the binder as though it were a live, explosive device. I did not raise my voice. I had no need to. In the brutal isolation of the Alaskan supply docks, I had learned that genuine authority never shouts. It simply moves into the room and crowds everything else out. I laid my hand flat on the leather cover and opened it. I drew out a stack of crisp documents. Then I looked directly at the lead venture capitalist, the same investor who had stood in my mudroom the previous night, sipping champagne while Clifford wiped mud from his patent leather Oxfords onto my starving wife's blanket. I slid a copy of the document across the smooth glass surface. It came to rest perfectly in front of him. I passed the remaining copies to the other investors, in turn paying no attention to Clifford's frantic, high-pitched protests behind me. Clifford shoved back from the table, his chair rolling into the wall. He jabbed a shaking finger in my direction, chest heaving. He pleaded with the investors to ignore the papers. He painted me as a deranged, estranged relative, driven by spite, a bitter old man who wanted to destroy his moment of triumph. He demanded someone summon building security to have me removed by force. The lead investor did not call security. He did not glance at Clifford at all. His eyes stayed fixed on my face, reading the cold, unyielding composure of the man who had put his host on the floor the night before without apparent effort. He raised a single hand, a gesture of absolute, unambiguous command, and told Clifford to sit down and be quiet. That one instruction stripped Clifford of whatever bravado he had left. He sank back into his chair, perspiring heavily, his tailored suit hanging on him now as though it had been made for a larger man. I stepped away from the table and clasped my hands at the small of my back. I told the room they were about to make a $5 million mistake. I asked them to read the first page of the document in their hands. I kept my voice measured and unhurried, delivering each word with slow, mechanical precision. I asked the venture capitalists what Clifford had told them about the seed capital that built his company. The lead investor scanned the opening paragraph, his brow drawing together in concentration. Without lifting his eyes from the page, he answered that Clifford had represented the initial $2.5 million as coming from a deceased relative, a wealthy uncle who had left behind a blind trust, providing the foundational capital to develop the proprietary software and secure the early patents. I nodded slowly and let that lie hang in the sterile, air-conditioned air of the boardroom. I said it was a compelling story, a carefully constructed narrative, built to project generational wealth stability and the appearance of inevitable success. But it was fiction, every word of it. There was no wealthy uncle. There was no blind trust. There was only a father-in-law who had believed enough in his daughter's future to sacrifice his own. I moved slowly around the perimeter of the glass table, the measured sound of my boots keeping pace with the hammering I knew was going on inside Clifford's chest. I gave the investors the truth. The $2.5 million was a bridge loan funded entirely out of my own pocket. I laid out how I had liquidated my modest retirement savings, sold off physical assets, and taken a brutal, high-risk logistics contract on the Arctic Ocean just to guarantee the line of credit. 24 months breathing air so cold it felt like inhaling crushed glass. 80-hour weeks on a frozen, sunless supply dock, managing heavy freight and hazardous cargo runs, wiring every cent back to Connecticut. I funded the code they were so eager to purchase. I funded the servers. I funded the polished glass table and the Italian leather chair Clifford was currently sweating through. The room stayed dead silent. The investors moved their eyes from the documents to Clifford, watching the sheer radiating panic of a man coming apart at his seams. I stopped moving and positioned myself directly behind Clifford, looking down at the top of his perfectly styled hair. I explained that while I was a blue-collar logistics manager, I was no fool. I understood that tech startups were volatile, high-risk ventures built on fragile promises. Because of that risk, I had my corporate attorney, Conrad, draft the original promissory note. It was never a gift. It was a heavily collateralized debt instrument. I directed the investors to turn to the second page and find paragraph 4. I asked the lead investor to read the collateral terms aloud. He traced the line with his index finger, eyes widening as the legal reality of what he was reading settled in. His voice carried across the quiet room as he read the clause. The loan was secured by the entirety of the company's intellectual property. All of it. Every line of code, every patent, every proprietary algorithm, and every trademark Clifford was attempting to sell them today was legally mine in the event of default. Clifford let out a pathetic, high-pitched wheeze. He slammed both hands onto the table, leaving damp prints on the glass. He insisted desperately that the loan was in good standing. He swore he had been making the minimum interest payments, routing funds through shell accounts. He argued I had no legal standing to interfere with the sale because the debt was not currently in default. He looked at the investors with wide, pleading eyes, urging them to see this as a minor administrative wrinkle he could smooth over the moment they wired him the $5 million. I leaned down and placed both hands on the back of Clifford's chair. I brought my face close to his ear, dropping my voice to a harsh, gravelly whisper that still found every corner of the room. I told him to look at Section 7. The lead investor turned to the next page, eyes moving quickly through the dense legal language. Section 7 was the acceleration clause. I spelled out its terms with slow, lethal clarity. The clause provided that the full principal, together with all compounded interest and maximum financial penalties, became immediately due and payable in full upon the discovery of severe fiduciary breach, criminal fraud, or gross moral turpitude involving the lender's immediate family. I straightened up and looked the lead investor directly in the eye. I announced that at 3:00 that morning, upon finding my wife shivering on a dog mat with unprescribed sedatives in her system, I had formally invoked that acceleration clause. I was demanding immediate repayment of the original capital, plus 24 months of maximum penalty interest. The total came to $3.8 million, and it was owed at that precise moment. Clifford made a sound that was equal parts sob and gasp. The air left his body as the absolute finality of his position closed over him. He did not have $3.8 million. He did not have a fraction of it. His company was running on borrowed fumes, kept alive only by the funds he'd stolen from Patty's medical accounts and the fraudulent $3 million mortgage he had forged against my estate. In 30 agonizing seconds, Clifford's company had gone from a coveted tech acquisition to a completely irreversibly insolvent wreck. The lead investor set the promissory note carefully down on the glass. He looked at Clifford with an expression of undisguised thorough contempt. These venture capitalists were hard men who understood exactly how power and money worked. They grasped the situation instantly. If they signed the buyout contract today, they would not be walking away with a revolutionary tech startup. They would be acquiring a hollow shell. The intellectual property they wanted was legally encumbered behind a wall of toxic debt, held by a man who would sooner reduce it all to ash than let them use a single line of code. The investor looked down at the $5 million contract, sitting squarely in front of Clifford. The silver pen still lay beside it, waiting for a signature that would never come. The investor extended his hand. Clifford lurched forward across the table, arms flailing, crying out. He begged the investor to wait. He promised he could clear the debt, fix the forgery, negotiate a settlement, if they would only advance him the funds. He sobbed openly, the polished and arrogant tech CEO evaporating, entirely replaced by a desperate, ruined boy, terrified of what his own choices had made inevitable. The lead investor paid him no attention whatsoever. What happens next in that room is something I still think about. The people who believed they held all the power are about to find out exactly how wrong they were, and it will cost them everything in a single moment they never saw coming. Tell me, if someone had been quietly working against you for years, Would you let them know you had figured it out, or would you wait until the very last second to show your hand? He took the thick stack of premium paper, the buyout agreement, and gripped it with both hands, knuckles going white, and tore it straight down the center. The sound of ripping paper was the sharpest, most violent thing in that room. He dropped the two jagged halves onto the glass table directly on top of Clifford's damp handprints. Then the investor calmly fastened the center button of his suit jacket. He looked down at Clifford and said with ice-cold finality that his firm did not conduct business with insolvent entities, and they certainly did not do business with men who wiped their shoes on starving women. The other investors said nothing at all. They snapped their leather briefcases shut without a sound. Not one of them looked at Clifford again. They moved past him as though he carried something contagious. The men filed around the table, passing me and Conrad on their way out. The lead investor offered me a single brief nod, quiet, deeply respectful, acknowledging the wreckage I had just brought down. They walked out through the heavy oak doors, their footsteps fading along the marble corridor. The room emptied. The grand illusion of success dissolved into the morning air like smoke. I stood in the stillness and looked down at the torn contract. The financial guillotine had fallen, and what remained was Conrad the accountant and a completely ruined man struggling to draw breath at the head of a shattered empire. The heavy oak doors clicked shut behind the last of them, sealing us inside. The silence was total. Clifford was alone. He stood at the head of the long glass table, staring down at the ripped halves of the $5 million contract. The venture capitalist had left his grand vision in tatters. His breathing came in ragged, shallow pulls. His chest labored beneath the expensive fabric of his tailored suit. I watched a single bead of sweat track down his temple and fall onto the glass. I said nothing. I simply stood there and let the full crushing mass of his financial ruin press the air from his lungs. Conrad stood to my left, hands resting easily in his pockets, watching my son-in-law with the detached patience of a man observing a snared animal. Fear follows a predictable pattern. When a desperate man discovers his shield is gone, he will always reach for whatever weapon is left. Clifford dragged a trembling hand across his face. The naked panic in his eyes curdled slowly into something cornered and manic. A harsh, broken laugh escaped him and bounced off the empty walls. He called me an absolute fool. He said I thought I had won by driving off his investors, but that I had no idea how the real game was played. He told me I was an uneducated logistics worker who had stumbled onto a corporate battlefield. Then Clifford reached inside his jacket. His fingers shook so badly he could barely find the inner pocket. He drew out a folded document heavily stamped with official blue ink. He slammed it down on the glass table beside the shredded remains of his buyout agreement. He smoothed the paper flat with frantic, sweaty palms and pointed a trembling finger at the heavy black signature line at the bottom. He told me to read it carefully. He declared it was a fully executed and legally binding medical and financial power of attorney. He claimed Patty had signed it over to him 3 months ago when her mind had supposedly begun its slide into dementia. He sneered, his lips pulling into an ugly, desperate grin. That proxy, he announced, granted him absolute and irrevocable control over every dimension of Patty's life, her medical decisions, her bank accounts, and most critically, her precise half of the equity in our Greenwich estate. Clifford pressed forward over the table, trying to project a physical dominance that his shaking knees completely betrayed. He told me my acceleration clause meant nothing to him. Because I did not hold sole ownership of the assets, he claimed I had no legal ground to freeze the estate. He laid out his final desperate play in breathless, rapid succession. As Patty's legal proxy, he said he held unilateral authority to liquidate her half of the property immediately. He threatened to sell the mansion to an anonymous cash buyer by 5 that evening. He had a fast-track escrow agent on standby who could bypass standard waiting periods for distressed sales. He looked me dead in the eye and swore he would take that cash, pay off his fractional debt, and route the remaining equity through untraceable offshore accounts, leaving me standing in the cold with nothing. Homeless and bankrupt by nightfall, he promised. He believed the threat of losing the house would break me. He assumed the mansion was my deepest weakness because he understood exactly what it had cost. He knew I had spent 24 months on a freezing Alaskan dock, destroying my back and my hands to pay off that mortgage. He calculated that I prized those walls and that roof above the reality of his crimes. What he failed to understand was that the moment I stepped into that dark mudroom and found my wife shivering on a filthy dog mat, the house stopped being a home. It became nothing more than a crime scene. I felt no attachment whatsoever to a structure built upon my wife's suffering. I did not flinch. I did not so much as glance at the document he was practically forcing into my face. I looked straight into his bloodshot, frantic eyes. I told him in a voice stripped of all emotion that he was holding a fraudulent piece of paper. Patty had never signed that proxy willingly. I laid out the precise truth of what he had done. I told him I knew he had confined her to that mudroom and kept her sedated on unprescribed medication to ensure her compliance, while he falsified a notary seal and forged her signature. Clifford laughed again. It was a high, hysterical sound with no real conviction underneath it. He dared me to prove it. He asked how a blue-collar truck driver was ever going to establish complex medical forgery against a legally stamped document in a court of law. The bank had already verified the signature, he said. State authorities had already processed the proxy. The legal system, he assured me, was built to protect men like him. By the time I filed a single piece of paperwork contesting the signature, the house would be sold and the money would be long gone. He leaned further across the glass, his breath carrying the smell of stale coffee in pure desperation. Once he had the cash, he promised he would use the power of attorney to have Patty permanently committed to a state psychiatric ward. I would never see my wife again. He told me I was entirely out of my depth, that I had brought a wrench to a corporate knife fight. I let those threats hang in the silence of the room. I let him savor the false belief that he still held a winning hand. I did not dispute his legal theories. I offered no argument that his plan was flawed. I simply stood there and watched a dead man going through the motions of still being alive. I looked across at Conrad. My attorney did not appear the slightest bit concerned. He simply checked his watch with the calm, calculating indifference of a man who already knew the outcome. The trap was fully closed. Clifford had just declared his reliance on a forged medical document in a room containing a federal contractor and a corporate lawyer. He had walked into the center of the kill zone carrying the very rope that would hang him. The boardroom held its silence as Clifford clutched his forged power of attorney, breathing hard, waiting for me to beg for my home. He expected negotiation. I did not move. I watched his desperate grin slowly collapse as it became clear that his ultimate weapon had produced no reaction whatsoever. He had tried to use my property against me, but he had never grasped that brick and mortar meant nothing set against my wife's survival. Conrad stepped forward. His polished leather shoes made a soft, measured sound against the thick carpet. He reached into his jacket and produced a second folder, thin, crisp, and white. He held it over the glass table and let it fall. It landed softly alongside the shredded remains of the buyout contract. Conrad regarded Clifford with the cold, mechanical dispassion of a butcher sizing up a cut of meat. He stated that a power of attorney is instantly nullified when the signature is obtained under conditions of extreme chemical duress. He told my son-in-law to open the white folder. Clifford stared at the folder as though it were something lethal coiled on the table in front of him. His hands trembled so badly he could barely grip the edge of the cover. He pulled it open. His bloodshot eyes moved across the first page, and whatever color still remained in his face and neck vanished completely. His jaw went loose. The arrogant sneer from moments ago dissolved into pure, undiluted terror. I kept my voice low and perfectly level. I told him he was looking at an emergency toxicology report from Greenwich Hospital, personally administered and expedited by the chief of medicine at 3 that morning. I watched Clifford's throat work as he swallowed. I told him the blood work had revealed massive lethal concentrations of a tightly regulated synthetic sedative, a brutal chemical compound engineered to suppress the central nervous system and induce severe memory loss. I moved a step closer to the edge of the glass table. I told him the hospital had signed a sworn affidavit confirming that Patty held no legal prescription for this narcotic whatsoever. The chief of medicine had formally declared her condition the result of sustained, systematic poisoning. Clifford stumbled backward until his legs found his heavy leather chair. He grabbed the armrests to hold himself upright. He stammered that it was all a terrible mistake. He tried to argue that Patty must have taken the pills on her own, confused and disoriented by her age. He clung desperately to the story that he was a caring family member navigating a heartbreaking mental decline. I did not allow him to finish the lie. I reminded him of the digital clone of his hard drive sitting inside my accountant's leather binder. I spelled out the fatal error his arrogance had cost him. Forensic experts had already traced the exact synthetic compound found in my wife's blood to a series of encrypted purchases he had made on the dark web over the previous 3 months. He had left a permanent digital receipt for the poison he used to torture her. Conrad leaned over the table and delivered the most devastating piece of legal reality. Clifford had not used his own private funds to acquire the illegal narcotics. He had been so desperate to sustain his lavish lifestyle that he routed the dark web transactions through his tech startup's corporate accounts, using the precise seed money I had given him to purchase the chemicals he used to imprison my wife. Conrad allowed himself a cold, predatory smile. He told Clifford that by channeling corporate funds into illegal offshore drug purchases, he had officially triggered federal wire fraud statutes. He had crossed from domestic abuse into the territory of a major federal crime. The forged power of attorney slipped from Clifford's damp fingers. The thick paper drifted harmlessly to the floor. He collapsed back into his chair. His chest heaved as he fought to draw air into his lungs. He was completely boxed in. The financial destruction of his company was no longer his most pressing problem. He was staring straight down the barrel of a lengthy prison sentence. He lifted his gaze to me, his eyes wet and pathetic. He begged me not to do this. He swore he would sign the house back over to me on the spot. He'd promised to walk away from Lacey and never go near our family again. He offered to leave the state that same day if I would simply agree to bury the toxicology report and the digital evidence. He was prepared to surrender everything to keep his freedom. I looked down at the man who had dragged my wife into a freezing closet. I thought about Patty struggling to hold her eyes open while he fed her laced water. I thought about the complete contempt he had shown for human life in order to preserve his luxury cars and his country club memberships. I told him I had not come here to negotiate a property dispute. I told him I had no interest in the house, the money, or his hollow promises. I leaned over the glass table until I was directly in his line of sight and spoke with a quiet, lethal precision. I told him the 24-hour window the police had granted me the previous night was not a grace period for him to repair his damage. It was exactly the time I needed to build a watertight criminal indictment. Clifford let out a strangled gasp. He looked desperately toward the heavy oak doors. I told him not to bother. The local authorities were no longer treating this as a civil matter. 2 senior detectives and a squad of uniformed officers were at that moment sitting in the polished marble lobby on the ground floor of this very building. They had not come to serve property papers. They were waiting by the elevators with a signed warrant for his arrest. I listed his charges, slowly giving him the time to absorb the complete destruction of his future. Felony elder abuse, severe chemical endangerment of a vulnerable adult, federal wire fraud tied to his corporate accounts. Clifford's entire body began to shake. He folded inward, drawing his knees toward his chest like a frightened child. He buried his face in his hands and broke into uncontrollable sobbing. The polished, confident tech executive was gone. What remained was a pathetic criminal waiting for steel handcuffs to close around his wrists. I did not feel a single moment of pity. I turned my back on him, gave Conrad and the accountant a nod, and we walked away from the glass table, leaving the shredded contracts and the toxicology report where they lay. I pushed through that heavy boardroom doors and walked out into the bright hallway. My wife was finally safe, and the man who had hurt her was about to lose everything. The silence left behind in that executive boardroom was heavy and absolute. Clifford stood frozen at the head of the long glass table, staring at the torn remains of his $5 million contract. Shallow, panicked breaths moved through him in waves. Every option had been exhausted. He had tried to use my home as a weapon, but his fraudulent power of attorney had just been crushed beneath the weight of medical evidence. Conrad stood quietly near the windows, radiating the calm indifference of a man who had already won. We did not wait long for the final consequence to arrive. The heavy oak doors swung open for the third and last time. Lacey walked in first. My daughter was wearing a pristine ivory designer dress and carrying a chilled bottle of imported champagne. A bright, oblivious smile stretched across her face. She had clearly been waiting somewhere downstairs, planning a grand entrance to celebrate her husband's enormous financial triumph. Instead, she walked into a graveyard of torn legal documents and a suffocating silence that hung like an open tomb. She stopped cold when she saw me standing beside the glass table. The champagne bottle slipped from her manicured hand and exploded against the polished marble floor. Green glass shattered outward, sending a foaming wave of alcohol spreading across the tiles. Before Lacey could form a single word of surprise, two plainclothes detectives stepped into the boardroom right behind her. They were tall, broad men who carried the uncompromising authority of the law in every line of their posture. They stepped across the pooling champagne and broken glass without a glance downward and without breaking stride. They looked past Lacey, entirely fixing their eyes on Clifford. The lead detective drew a leather badge holder from his belt and made his presence known. His voice was measured, but it carried a resonant weight that seemed to drain what little air remained in the room. He addressed Clifford by his full legal name and stated clearly that they held a warrant for his immediate arrest. The detective did not rush through the charges. He read them aloud with deliberate, unhurried precision so that every person still standing in that room understood the exact nature of the crimes committed. Felony elder abuse, severe chemical endangerment of a vulnerable adult, federal wire fraud, and identity theft. Each word the detective spoke was another nail driven into Clifford's coffin. The second detective moved smoothly around the perimeter of the shattered glass and approached the head of the table. He unclipped a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt. The metallic clink rang out sharply against the floor-to-ceiling windows. Panic is a remarkable truth serum. The instant Clifford registered that sound, his survival instincts swept away whatever was left of his manufactured corporate persona. He backed away from the table with his trembling hands raised in a desperate defensive gesture. He looked between the two detectives, his bloodshot eyes wide, his breathing coming in rapid, shallow bursts. A shaking, sweat-soaked finger rose and pointed across the room directly at his wife. He screamed that they had the wrong person. He screamed that he had absolutely nothing to do with the physical administration of the narcotics. He declared with total conviction that the entire chemical imprisonment had been Lacey's idea from the very beginning. Lacey gasped as though something had knocked all the air from her body. She pressed her back flat against the polished wood paneling of the boardroom wall. Clifford did not slow down. He threw the woman he supposedly loved entirely under the bus, without a heartbeat of hesitation or remorse. He shrieked that Lacey was the one who had coveted the Greenwich estate and wanted to lock down the inheritance. He claimed she was the one who ground the heavy sedatives into powder. He swore to the detectives that Lacey had personally stirred the dangerous chemicals into Patty's warm broth while he was occupied in his study. He insisted he was just a driven executive and that his wife had engineered the entire nightmare to protect her luxury lifestyle. I stood completely still, watching the moral rot at the core of my bloodline expose itself in the cold morning light. I knew Clifford was lying to preserve himself. I held the digital receipts, proving he had bought the drugs. I knew he was the one who had thrown the deadbolt on the mudroom door, but his cowardly, frantic accusation tore away the last shred of illusion Lacey still carried about her marriage. The man she had sacrificed her own mother's suffering for was now cheerfully offering her up to a federal prison sentence just to purchase himself a sliver of reasonable doubt. Lacey slid slowly down the wall until she crumpled onto the floor. She drew her knees tight against her chest and wrapped both arms around her legs. She began to weep, not quietly, not with any dignity. It was the raw, hysterical wailing of a woman watching her entire world collapse into a permanent black hole of consequences. She shook her head back and forth, unable to put together a single coherent sentence to counter her husband's vicious accusations. The hem of her expensive ivory dress was soaking up the spilled champagne, but she was beyond noticing. She simply shrank into the corner, a broken, diminished shell of the arrogant daughter who had once told her mother to endure torture for the sake of an imported sports car. The lead detective had no patience for Clifford's hysterical deflections. He gave his partner a single nod. The second detective lunged forward, seized Clifford hard by the shoulder, spun him around, and drove him face down onto the polished glass table. The impact rattled the thick surface. Clifford cried out in pain and shock as the detective wrenched his arms behind his back. The steel cuffs snapped shut around his wrists with a loud, decisive click, pinning his arms firmly together. Clifford fought against the restraints, kicking his expensive leather shoes against the table legs. He threw his head from side to side, weeping openly in front of the men who had come to finish him. He begged the detectives to look at his phone. He pleaded with them to pull the security footage from the house. He shrieked over and over that Lacey was the real monster, and that he was just a desperate man trying to keep a failing company from going under. The detectives paid his rambling no attention whatsoever. They hauled him upright, pulling hard on his restrained arms, and began steering him away from the table toward the exit. As they dragged him past me, Clifford's tear-filled eyes locked onto mine. He looked like a lost, terrified child, begging a parent to pull him out of a nightmare. His mouth opened. He wanted to beg to plead for some fragment of mercy, but I turned my head away. I would not give him the dignity of acknowledgement. He was nothing to me anymore. He was a common thief who had stolen time from my wife, and he was going to settle that debt in a concrete cell. The detectives hauled him into the marble hallway. His desperate screaming echoed down the corridor, bouncing off the walls until the elevator doors slid shut and swallowed his voice completely. The quiet that fell over the boardroom was heavy and absolutely final. Conrad gathered his white folder from the table, leaving the shredded contract exactly where it lay. He straightened his jacket and moved toward the exit without a glance at the woman sobbing in the corner. I stood there one last moment, breathing in the sterile air of the room. The long hunt was over. I turned away from the wreckage and walked out, leaving Lacey alone on the wet floor to sit with the silence of her choices. The heavy oak doors clicked shut behind me. The only sound remaining in that vast space was my daughter's ragged sobbing. Lacey was still folded into the corner of the room. Her pristine ivory designer dress was drenched in spilled champagne and littered with fragments of green glass. She looked like a shattered porcelain figure discarded among the ruins of her own greed. Conrad and the forensic accountant quietly gathered their leather binders and laptops. Neither spared a glance at the woman on the floor. Conrad gave me a brief nod, then stepped through the door and into the hallway. I was alone with the daughter who had watched her mother suffer and done nothing. I stood near the edge of this glass table, looking down at the torn pieces of the $5 million contract, listening to Lacey struggle for breath. Slowly she raised her head and looked up at me. Her expensive makeup was smeared in dark, ugly streaks across her face. She read the cold, empty expression I wore, and panic moved through her features. Her husband was gone. Her financial shield was in pieces. She pushed herself up onto her hands and knees, ignoring the sharp fragments of glass that cut into her palms. She crawled across the wet marble until she reached my boots, wrapped both arms around my legs, and buried her wet face against my trousers. She began to beg. The words came in a frantic, unbroken torrent. She implored me to forgive her. She swore she had no idea how far Clifford was willing to go. She claimed she had been terrified of him, that he controlled every dimension of their lives. She said he had threatened to leave her with nothing if she refused to go along with his plans. She told me between sobs that she had wanted to call the police for her mother, but had been completely paralyzed by fear. She cast herself as a helpless prisoner in a gilded cage, unable to break free from her husband's grip. She looked up at me with wide, pleading eyes, searching for the forgiving father who used to carry her on his shoulders in the Alaskan snow. She was looking for the man who had worked 80-hour weeks on a freezing dock just to give her everything she wanted. She expected warmth and unconditional love. I looked down at her and felt absolutely nothing. The well of a father's love had run dry the moment I found Patty shivering on that dog mat. I did not reach down to help her. I did not put a steadying hand on her trembling shoulder. I simply looked at her with the cold, heavy detachment of a judge regarding a condemned person. I told her to stop lying. My voice was quiet and perfectly flat, but it carried a precision that cut straight through her hysterical crying. I told her I knew exactly who she was and precisely what she had done. I brought up the Amber Alert. I brought up the locked mudroom door. I dismantled her victim narrative piece by piece. I told her a terrified hostage does not stand in a warm kitchen drinking expensive wine while her mother freezes in a utility closet. A hostage does not authorize a fraudulent psychiatric evaluation to have her own mother committed to a state asylum. Lacey shook her head frantically, insisting she'd had no choice. She stammered about social pressure and country club memberships and the crushing debt Clifford had concealed from her. She said she needed the lifestyle to survive in their social circle. She pleaded with me to understand that she had only been trying to keep them afloat until the buyout went through. I stepped back, forcing her arms to release my legs. She pitched forward onto the wet marble shoulders, heaving. I told her I understood everything with perfect clarity. I told her she was not paralyzed by fear of a dangerous husband. She was paralyzed by the terrifying prospect of losing her imported cars and her designer clothes. I laid out the full portrait of her betrayal, so she could never look away from it. I told her she had stood there and watched a man scrape his filth across the very woman who brought her into this world. I told her she had picked a life of absolute luxury over her own mother's chance at survival. She had sold her soul for a cushioned seat at a country club, and now the bill for that transaction had come due. The finality in my voice stopped Lacey cold. She looked up at me, chest heaving, the true weight of her situation finally crashing down on her. She understood there was no forgiveness in this room, no hidden account, no secret trust fund positioned to break her fall. She was completely, utterly alone. I reached into the inner pocket of my coat and drew out a single crisp sheet of white paper. No grand leather binder, no dense corporate filing, just a clean, straightforward legal form that Conrad had pushed through the local courts earlier that morning. I let it slip from my fingers. It drifted down through the still air and settled softly on the wet floor beside her trembling hands. I told her it was a formal eviction notice signed and certified by a county judge. I reminded her that the Greenwich estate belonged wholly to me and Patty. The fraudulent mortgage Clifford had forged was already being unwound by federal investigators. The house was mine, and she was no longer welcome on my property. Lacey stared at that paper as if the words on it were in a language she'd never encountered. She gasped, her throat clamped too tight with panic to form a sentence. I didn't give her the room to construct another lie or negotiate another compromise. I laid out the terms of her severance with blunt, unsparing precision. She had exactly 2 hours to return to the Greenwich Estate Walk, inside, and pack one suitcase. I was specific about what that meant. Basic clothing, personal toiletries, nothing else. Any jewelry purchased with the money Clifford had drained from my accounts was forbidden. The imported cars in the driveway were collateralized assets, now the property of my legal trust. She wouldn't be leaving in one of them. She could call a cab or leave on foot. Lacey began to hyperventilate. She clawed at the air between us, begging me not to put her out on the street. She cried that she had no money of her own and no place to land. She pleaded for a few days, just enough time to work something out. She asked how any father could do this to his own child. I looked down at her, unmoved by a single tear. I told her my daughter died the day she allowed a monster to poison her mother. The woman on the floor, I said, was nothing more than a parasite who had finally exhausted her hosts. I informed her that a private security team was changing the locks on the estate at exactly 12 Sibiru. If she remained on the premises 1 minute past noon, the armed guards had standing orders to drag her to the curb and have her arrested for criminal trespassing. I didn't wait for her to absorb the full collapse of her comfortable world. I had already given this building more of my time than it deserved. I turned my back on the wreckage of what had once been my family and walked toward the heavy oak doors. I didn't look back when she screamed my name. I didn't break stride when I heard her sobbing escalate into a wretched guttural wail. I left the boardroom and stepped into the elevator. As the metal doors closed and cut off the sound of her despair, a profound, heavy stillness settled across my chest. I pressed the lobby button. The poison had been fully cut from our lives. Clifford was in a police cruiser staring down decades in federal prison. Lacey was weeping on a boardroom floor with nothing but the clothes on her back and a 2-hour clock running down to homelessness. My wealth was intact. My property was secure. I walked out of the glass tower into the crisp morning air, hailed a cab, and gave the driver the address for Greenwich Hospital. My wife was waiting. We finally had the rest of our lives ahead of us to rebuild in peace. I returned to the Greenwich estate beneath a clear midday Connecticut sky. The imposing wrought iron gates were already locked open. A fleet of heavy utility trucks and flatbed trailers lined the long circular driveway. I had authorized Conrad to dispatch a premier asset liquidation firm, the moment the police put Clifford in the back of a squad car. These were not gentle residential movers. They were a highly coordinated commercial retrieval team with one directive: seize every physical item purchased with my stolen capital. I left my car on the street and walked up the paved drive, listening to the clean, satisfying sound of systematic dismantling. Two repo men were already running thick steel chains under the frame of Clifford's imported black sports car, dragging the heavy machine up the angled bed of a tow truck with ruthless efficiency. The luxury vehicle Lacey had chosen over her own mother's life was now just a confiscated piece of metal headed for a police auction. I walked through the heavy wooden front doors into the grand foyer. The place was controlled chaos. A dozen workers in matching uniforms were stripping the mansion to the walls. I watched them dismantle the grand dining table where Clifford had hosted his arrogant dinner party the night before. The custom leather chairs were stacked and hauled away, leaving only bare hardwood floors behind. Oversized velvet sofas went out the door. Massive crystal chandeliers came down. Expensive modern art was unhooked from the walls, leaving pale rectangular shadows on the white paint. Every piece of designer luxury Clifford and Lacey had accumulated over the past 2 years was being marched out the front door to settle the immense fraudulent debt they had accrued. I climbed the grand curving staircase, the heavy boots of the workers echoing through the hollowed-out halls. I found Lacey in the master suite. She was frantically forcing clothes into a single black leather suitcase. Her pristine ivory designer dress from the boardroom was wrinkled and ruined. Mascara was still smeared across her face in dark, ragged streaks. She looked around the vast bedroom as workers methodically removed the expensive dressers and custom silk curtains, watching her entire universe dissolve in real time. She moved with a desperate, frantic energy, hurling silk blouses and cashmere sweaters into the bag without folding a single piece. The 2-hour window was closing fast. I stood in the doorway and watched her unravel. She wouldn't look at me. She refused to meet my eyes. She yanked the overstuffed suitcase shut with shaking hands and grabbed the handle. Then her gaze landed on a small wooden side table the workers hadn't reached yet. On top of it sat Patty's antique mahogany jewelry box, a handcrafted piece I had bought for my wife 30 years ago on a small island in the Pacific. Inside it were Patty's wedding band and the garnet earrings she cherished above all else. Lacey reached out and took the polished wooden box. She tucked it firmly under her arm and moved toward the doorway. I stepped forward and filled it with my body. She stopped and looked up at me, chest-heaving breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. She told me she needed the jewelry to pawn so she could afford a hotel room for the week. She had no money for food or shelter, she said. She begged me to let her have just this one thing. She told me she was my daughter and that I couldn't send her into the street to starve. I looked back at her without a trace of paternal warmth. My expression was as cold and flat as the frozen Alaskan tundra. I reached out and closed my calloused fingers around the polished box. Lacey pulled, but she didn't have the strength to hold on. I pried it from her trembling hands with slow, deliberate force and held it safely against my chest. I told her the luxury she was trying to walk off with had been purchased with stolen home equity and the literal poisoning of her mother. I reminded her that she had willingly traded her soul for a cushioned seat at a country club, and that she was now paying the ultimate price for that choice. I told her she had stood by while a criminal wiped his dirty shoes on the woman who gave her life. I told her she had chosen her own comfortable existence over her mother's basic survival. I told her she had surrendered the right to call herself my daughter the moment she left Patty to suffer alone in a freezing closet. I stepped aside and pointed down the long, bare hallway. I told her to get out of my house. Lacey let out a broken, pathetic sob. She seized the handle of her single suitcase and dragged it down the stairs. The wheels clattered loudly against each hardwood step. I followed right behind her, making certain she didn't lay a finger on another object in my home. We crossed the empty foyer and stepped out onto the front porch. The repo men were pulling the last flatbed truck down the driveway, carrying off the final remnants of Clifford's fraudulent empire. The manicured lawns and expensive topiary now looked like a hollow stage set, stripped of its actors. Lacey stood at the edge of the stone steps, staring out at the empty driveway. She had nothing left. No husband, no home, no family. She turned and looked at me one final time, her eyes silently begging for one last moment of mercy. I looked straight through her. I stepped back into the foyer and swung the heavy wooden front door shut. The deadbolt engaged with a loud, hard click. I stood alone in the quiet, empty house, holding my wife's jewelry box, and left Lacey standing by herself on the curb. The drive back to Greenwich Hospital felt nothing like the frantic, panicked trip I had made just 3 days earlier. The Connecticut sky above me was a brilliant, piercing blue, and the heavy storm clouds that had seemed to hover over my life for so long had finally broken apart and vanished. I kept my hands steady on the wheel. I let the quiet hum of the engine fill the car and allowed the stillness of the afternoon to settle over me. The grand estate was behind me now. The liquidation crews were methodically tearing down every false monument of Clifford's fraudulent world piece by piece. The antique furniture, the imported sports cars, the massive crystal chandeliers, all of it gone. Nothing but ghosts. I felt not a single moment of regret leaving that property in the rearview mirror. A house is wood and stone. A home requires love and safety. That mansion had become a cold concrete prison, and I was finally walking away from it for good. I pulled into the hospital lot and walked through the sliding glass doors. The bright, sterile lobby lights no longer felt cold and intimidating. They felt like a clear path forward. I passed the reception desk, stepped into the elevator, and pressed the button for the intensive recovery ward. My heavy work boots made soft, even thuds against the linoleum floor as I moved down the long, quiet corridor. The nurses at the central station recognized me right away. A young nurse with kind eyes looked up and nodded toward the far end of the hall. She told me Patty had been asking for me all morning and that her recovery had been nothing short of miraculous. I thanked her and kept walking, feeling a surge of pure adrenaline move through me. I pushed open the door to Patty's room and stepped inside. Warm golden sunlight poured through the large window and filled the room. The medical monitors beeped in a slow, calm, steady rhythm. I stopped at the foot of the bed and felt every last bit of tension drain out of my shoulders. Patty was no longer the frail, shivering woman I had found trapped in that dark mudroom. The lethal synthetic sedatives were finally clearing her system. She was sitting up against a stack of crisp white pillows. The gray, sickly pallor of her skin had given way to a soft, healthy pink. The dark bruising around her eyes had faded, and her cheeks held a flush of returning life. Her silver hair was neatly brushed and resting softly at her shoulders, but the most beautiful thing was her eyes. The vacant, hollow stare that the chemical poison had put there was completely gone. Her eyes were bright and clear and fully present. She spotted me in the doorway, and a wide, genuine smile spread across her face. I crossed to the side of the bed and settled into the plastic visitor chair. I reached out and took her hands gently in mine. Her fingers were no longer cold. They were warm and steady, and they closed around mine with a grip strong enough to bring tears to my eyes. I leaned forward and pressed my forehead against hers. No words were necessary in that moment. The long, suffocating nightmare was finally over. We sat together in the quiet room, breathing the same air, marveling at the fact that we had made it through the worst betrayal two people could endure. After a long moment, I pulled back and looked into her eyes. I reached into the inner pocket of my coat and drew out a thick folded document. Not a fraudulent power of attorney, not a forged mortgage agreement. It was the official property transfer deed drawn up by Conrad and fully executed by the state courts. I unfolded it and laid it gently across her lap over the white hospital blankets. I kept my voice low and even. I told her that Clifford was sitting in a federal holding cell, awaiting his arraignment, facing decades behind bars for what he had done to her. I watched her face soften with deep, quiet relief. Then I told her about Lacey. I didn't soften it. I explained how our daughter had chosen her luxury cars and her country club life over her own mother's survival. I told Patty I had evicted Lacey from the estate and left her on the curb with nothing but a single suitcase. Patty closed her eyes for a brief moment, and a single tear traced a slow line down her cheek. It was a tear of mourning for the daughter we had believed we raised, but she wiped it away quickly. She opened her eyes and gave a slow, silent nod. We both understood that the rot had to be fully cut out before any healing could begin. I pointed to the transfer deed on her lap. I told her the massive estate was being liquidated. The grand mansion, with its heavy oak doors and cold marble floors, was officially gone. I explained that the proceeds from the sale would clear the fraudulent debts Clifford had run up and leave us with a very comfortable nest egg. I promised her we were never setting foot in that house again. It was a monument to greed and betrayal, and we had no use for it. Patty reached down and ran her warm fingers over the thick black ink of the signature line. She looked up at me, her smile widening. She felt no grief over the lost estate. The luxury, the prestige, none of it mattered to her. She simply gripped my hand and squeezed. I told her we could go anywhere she chose. A small warm cabin by a quiet lake. A modest house near the ocean where the air was clean and the mornings were still. We had our whole lives in front of us, and for the first time in a long time, we were entirely free. The chains of deception and financial abuse had been broken for good. The people who had tried to bury us were now drowning in the fallout of their own choices. I sat beside my wife in the golden afternoon light, her warm hands in mine. We had passed through absolute darkness and survived the poison of our own bloodline. Now we were walking back into the light together with nothing to guide us but the plain and simple truth. 6 months is a very specific and precise measure of time. For a man actively rebuilding his life alongside a recovering wife, 6 months feels like a warm and fleeting breath of fresh spring air. For a man locked inside a sterile federal holding facility, waiting for his inevitable financial and personal ruin, 6 months feels like an absolute and crushing eternity. The federal courthouse in downtown Bridgeport was a massive, imposing structure built entirely of cold, polished granite and heavy, dark oak paneling, deliberately designed to make every person who entered feel small and insignificant before the full weight of the law. I sat quietly in the second row of the public gallery. The solid wooden bench was hard and unyielding against my spine. I wore a simple charcoal suit and a plain dark tie. I hadn't come to this courthouse to gloat or celebrate. I came to sit in that quiet room and witness the final equation of justice, working itself out to its conclusion. Clifford sat at the heavy wooden defense table near the front. He was absolutely unrecognizable no longer. The arrogant, wealthy corporate executive who had sneered at me across a glass boardroom table just a few months before. The expensive tailored suits and imported silk ties had been replaced by a shapeless, dull orange prison jumpsuit hanging loosely off his rapidly shrinking frame. His thick dark hair had thinned badly and gone a pale sickly gray at the temples. He sat with his narrow shoulders slumped forward, staring blankly down at his chained wrists on the wooden table. The judge sat high above him on the elevated bench, regarding my former son-in-law with absolute judicial contempt. The magistrate wasted no time on dramatic theatrics or grand moral speeches. He read through the dense summary of federal charges with a flat, mechanical precision that slowly peeled away whatever remaining shreds of dignity Clifford believed he still held. The judge detailed the severe chemical endangerment of Patty, the exact dark web, purchases the toxic sedatives. He outlined the extensive and deliberate wire fraud used to siphon corporate funds. He enumerated the cowardly forgery of medical and legal documents, including the fraudulent power of attorney. Then the final sentence dropped onto the silent courtroom, like a heavy iron vault door swinging permanently shut. The judge sentenced my former son-in-law to a mandatory minimum of 15 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. No possibility of early parole. No leniency for his prior corporate standing or his wealthy background. Clifford buckled forward, pressing his damp forehead against the heavy wooden table. A low, muffled sound escaped him and carried faintly across the stillness of the room. It was the sound of a man who finally understood. His life was officially and completely finished. He would be old and broken before he ever walked outside those high concrete walls again. 2 heavy-set federal marshals moved forward to take the prisoner away. They grabbed Clifford firmly by the upper arms and pulled him to his feet. As they turned him toward the secured side exit, he stopped and looked back into the gallery. His sunken, bloodshot eyes swept frantically across the wooden benches until they found mine. I knew exactly what he was hunting for in that final pathetic moment before they took him away. He wanted a reaction. He needed to see burning rage or a triumphant, vindictive smile on my face. He had to believe his actions had carved some lasting emotional wound into my soul. He needed to feel like he still mattered to me even as a defeated enemy. I gave him nothing at all. I sat perfectly still, hands resting loosely on my knees, and looked back at him with the same mild, hollow indifference a person might show watching a stranger pull out of a parking space. There was no anger left in me, no hatred, no bitterness, no joy, only a vast and quiet emptiness. Clifford was no longer a threat, a monster, or a rival. He was simply a canceled debt that had finally been cleared off my ledger. I watched his pale face twist in agony as that realization fully settled over him. The complete absence of emotion in my eyes cut him far deeper than any shouted insult or physical blow ever could. It confirmed his total erasure from our lives. He was entirely irrelevant. The federal marshals hauled hard on his restrained arms and pulled him through the heavy wooden side doors. The steel latch clicked shut behind him, sealing him away for good. The judge struck his gavel and called a brief recess to prepare the courtroom for the next case on the morning docket. The sparse gallery crowd rose slowly and began filtering out into the bright marble hallway. I walked out of the dark courtroom and drew a long, deep breath of cool, conditioned air. The corridor was wide and lined with tall glass windows, looking out over the busy streets below. I moved at an easy pace toward a small, recessed alcove, housing a row of glowing vending machines. A profound sense of closure was settling deep into my bones. Patty was safely at home right now, putting in a brand new garden behind our quiet coastal cottage. The long nightmare was officially buried. Then I heard the frantic shuffling of cheap rubber soles, squeaking against the polished marble floor. I turned and saw a woman hurrying toward me down the long, empty corridor. It took my brain a full 3 seconds to process what I was seeing and recognize my own daughter. Lacey looked absolutely terrible. The glamorous, arrogant socialite who had once dropped thousands on weekend spa retreats and imported champagne was gone without a trace. Her custom designer wardrobe had been replaced by a stiff, scratchy polyester uniform from a discount retail chain, dull, faded blue, hanging awkwardly on her noticeably thin frame. Her normally perfect blonde hair was pulled back in a messy fraying knot, and the dark circles beneath her eyes spoke of countless, sleepless nights in a row. She looked pale, exhausted, and completely ground down by the relentless weight of her new reality. She stopped a few feet in front of me, breathing hard, twisting her rough, unmanicured hands nervously at her waist. She looked up at me with red-rimmed, watery eyes. She didn't call me Dad. She didn't reach for fake dramatic apologies or pretend she'd suddenly discovered her conscience. She simply looked at me with the raw, naked desperation of a cornered animal going under. She began to speak in a rapid, breathless whisper. She told me she had lost the cramped little apartment she'd been renting on the industrial edge of town. Her retail job barely covered groceries, and she was completely out of options. She'd been sleeping in the dusty back inventory room of the store for 3 days, and that morning the regional manager had found her and let her go on the spot. She stepped toward me and asked for a small loan, just enough for a security deposit, on a cheap studio apartment. She promised to pay back every penny out of her next paychecks if she could manage to find another job. She stood there shivering in the courthouse air conditioning, openly begging for a financial lifeline from the man she had thrown away. I stood in that quiet alcove and looked at the dark grease stains on her cheap retail uniform. I looked at the frantic, desperate twitch of her thin fingers. I remembered the exact cold tone of her voice the day she told her own mother she was being selfish for wanting to survive. I remembered the arrogant sneers she wore while actively plotting to have my wife committed to a state asylum just to protect her precious country club standing. I remembered watching her step over her mother's dignity without a moment of hesitation. I reached slowly into the inner breast pocket of my suit jacket and drew out my leather wallet. Lacey let out a soft, ragged sigh of relief. Her tense shoulders dropped, and she stepped closer, fully expecting a thick stack of bills to appear and erase her mistakes. She believed the bond of blood would ultimately override everything she had done. I opened the wallet and pulled out a single, crisp $20 bill. I did not hold it toward her. I turned my back on my daughter and walked the remaining few steps to the glowing coffee vending machine. I fed the bill deliberately into the slot and pressed the button for a plain black coffee. The machine hummed and whirred loudly, dropping a small cardboard cup and filling it with steaming dark liquid. It clicked heavily a few times and returned $18.50 in crumpled bills and heavy silver coins. I picked up the hot cup with my left hand. I scooped up the change with my right. Then I turned back around and looked at Lacey. She was staring at me with an expression of pure sheer confusion dissolving rapidly into panic. She couldn't make sense of what was happening. I reached out and dropped the crumpled bills and the handful of coins directly into her open, trembling palms. I looked straight into her terrified, watery eyes. My voice was calm, flat, and entirely free of parental warmth. I told her she was an adult. I told her to survive. I didn't wait to see her reaction. No tears, no screaming, no desperate bargaining. I had no interest in any of it. I simply turned and walked down the long, bright marble corridor, taking a slow and deliberate sip of my hot black coffee. The sound of her quiet, pathetic weeping echoed faintly off the cold walls behind me, but I never broke stride or turned my head. I pushed open the heavy glass doors at the end of the corridor and stepped out into the warm afternoon sun, leaving the last ghost of my past buried permanently in the shadows behind me. The air in the Berkshires, Massachusetts, tasted nothing like the heavy, suffocating atmosphere of the Greenwich estate. It was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of pine needles and damp earth. I stood on the wide wooden porch of our new home and let the morning breeze move across my face. The cabin was modest. It was a single-story structure built of thick pine logs with a wide wraparound porch that looked out over a vast, tranquil lake. No imported crystal chandeliers hung inside. No custom marble floors, no velvet sofas built for arrogant dinner parties. Only solid wood and warm light and absolute peace. We owned every timber and every square inch of the land outright. We had paid for it entirely in cash, using a fraction of the liquidated proceeds from the mansion. No banks involved, no mortgage, no financial leeches lurking in the shadows, ready to bleed our accounts dry. We were completely and entirely free. I carried 2 steaming mugs of dark roast coffee, the ceramic warm against my calloused palms. I crossed the wooden planks of the porch slowly and handed one to my wife. Patty was sitting in a sturdy rocking chair wrapped in a thick wool blanket. The change in her over the last 6 months had been nothing short of miraculous. The frail, shivering shell of a woman I had found locked in that dark mudroom was gone without a trace. Her skin held a healthy, rosy flush. Her eyes were bright and sharp and full of quiet, steady joy. The brutal synthetic sedatives had been completely cleared from her system, and her mind was wholly her own again. She took the warm mug from my hands and smiled up at me. It was the same beautiful, honest smile I had fallen in love with 4 decades ago. I settled into the rocking chair beside hers, and together we watched the morning mist drift slowly across the surface of the quiet lake. We didn't speak for a long time. We had no need to fill the silence with idle words. We had earned this quiet morning through a terrible, exhausting war, and we intended to savor every second of it. I looked down at my hands wrapped around the hot ceramic. The deep scars and permanent calluses were a map of everything I had lived through. I thought about the decades I had spent building a foundation for my family. I thought about the years I had sacrificed so my daughter could live a life of comfort and privilege. My mind drifted back to the grinding years I had spent working on an Alaskan oil rig. The memory of the freezing rain came back with sudden, vivid force, punishing 18-hour shifts out on exposed steel decking. The wind off the Arctic Ocean hit like thousands of invisible blades, slicing through heavy protective gear. I remembered the iron chains and the deafening roar of the drilling machinery. I remembered the bone-deep cold that locked into my joints and refused to leave, even huddled next to the small space heater in my cramped bunk. I endured that brutal isolation and physical punishment for one reason alone. I wanted my wife and my child to never know what true desperation felt like. I wanted to build a financial fortress, solid enough to shield them from the world's hardest realities. But sitting on that porch, gazing out at the still water, I understood that those years of grueling work had taught me something far more valuable, a lesson about pure survival that I had ignored for far too long. When you work a steel platform in the middle of a violent ocean, you learn to read danger the moment it appears. If a heavy chain is compromised or an iron gear begins to rust, you don't cling to it out of sentimentality. You don't hold on to broken machinery. simply because it has been part of the operation for years. You understand that a rusted link will eventually give way and drag the whole platform down into freezing water. You learn the discipline of ruthless excision. You cut the rot away without hesitation to protect the integrity of what remains. I had failed to apply that same cold logic to my own family. I had let the rot spread unchecked. Lacey and Clifford were not family. They were parasites, sheltering behind the sacred mask of kinship. They had looked at decades of my backbreaking labor and seen nothing but a convenient account waiting to be emptied. They had looked at my vulnerable wife and seen only an obstacle standing between them and an unearned inheritance. I had endured their arrogance and their bottomless greed for years because I had confused unconditional love with tolerating toxic behavior. I had protected the rusted links of my family chain right up until they finally snapped and nearly killed the only person who truly mattered to me. The quiet isolation of this cabin made everything perfectly clear. The ruthless excision I had carried out 6 months ago was not vengeance or cruelty. It was a necessary amputation of diseased tissue. I had cut Clifford and Lacey out of our lives with the exact same cold, mechanical precision I would have used to sever a broken chain on the rig. I had stripped them of their stolen wealth and left them to face the full consequences of their own monstrous choices. I felt no guilt leaving my daughter on the curb with a single suitcase. I felt no remorse watching Clifford hauled away in steel handcuffs. They had chosen their path. I had simply delivered them to its final destination. Patty shifted in her rocking chair, the wooden runners creaking softly against the porch boards. She reached over and rested her warm hand on my arm. She didn't ask what I was thinking about. She already knew. We had spent the last 6 months slowly rebuilding our trust in the world and in each other. Long evenings talking through the betrayal, the pain, the raw terror of what had almost been taken from her. But we had also spent that time planning this new life. We had chosen this remote location deliberately to put distance between ourselves and the poisoned world that had corrupted our daughter. We had chosen the simplicity of the pine log cabin to remind ourselves that real wealth cannot be measured in imported cars or grand marble foyers. Real wealth is the ability to wake up each morning feeling completely safe inside your own home. I looked at Patty and gave her hand a gentle squeeze. The dark shadows of the past were finally gone. We had survived the ultimate betrayal and come through the other side with our dignity and our peace fully intact. I took a slow sip of my dark roast coffee and felt the warmth spread through my chest. The sun climbed higher above the tree line, throwing bright golden light across the rippling surface of the lake. We were entirely alone, and for the first time in our lives, that isolation carried no feeling of sacrifice. It felt like an absolute victory. We had defended what mattered most, and we were finally ready to live. The afternoon shadows stretched long and thin across the cabin's wooden floorboards. The air was cooling, drawing in the rich, clean smell of damp earth and pine from the surrounding forest. I sat at the small kitchen table, wiping down a set of simple wooden bowls we had picked up at a local market. Through the open window came the soft, steady lapping of the lake against the muddy shoreline, a rhythmic, soothing sound that had entirely replaced the constant noise of city traffic and the grinding stress of corporate life. Patty was resting in the next room, taking a quiet afternoon nap beneath a thick, handmade quilt. Our life had contracted down to these essential elements: wood and water and stillness. No more grand dinner parties to host. No more forced conversations with people who measured our worth by the label on our clothing. Only a profound and absolute quiet that we had fought incredibly hard to earn. My cell phone sat on the kitchen counter a few steps away. A new phone, a new number shared with only a small handful of essential contacts. Conrad, my medical team, and no one else. It began to vibrate against the smooth wooden surface. The buzzing felt like a sharp intrusion into the calm of our home. I walked over and looked at the glowing screen. The caller ID showed an unknown number from a familiar area code. I wiped my hands on a cloth towel and swiped to answer. I put the phone to my ear and said hello. The voice on the other end was frantic and breathless. It was Lacey. Her weeping flooded the speaker immediately. She was talking so fast her words ran together into a high-pitched torrent of pure panic. I didn't interrupt. I simply stood in the quiet kitchen and listened to the desperate unraveling of a woman who had exhausted every last option. She told me she had tracked down my new number through a former business associate. She did not ask how I was. She did not ask about her mother. She plunged straight into a chaotic account of her latest crisis. She was crying hysterically, explaining that the cheap used car she had scraped together enough money to buy a few months ago had broken down completely on the side of a busy highway. Smoke was pouring from under the hood, and she was stranded in the fading daylight. Her voice carried that same note of entitled expectation she had used her entire life. The tears were real enough, but underneath them ran a hard, demanding edge. She was waiting for me to slide back into my old familiar role. She expected a sudden surge of paternal alarm. She expected me to demand her location, summon an expensive tow truck, and wire enough money to put her in a reliable vehicle. She cried that she had no money for a mechanic and that her retail job would let her go if she missed her evening shift. She begged me to come to her rescue. She told me she was terrified and alone on the side of the road. As I listened to her sobbing, my mind drifted far from the warm kitchen. I was back in my younger years, standing on the frozen steel deck of an Alaskan oil rig. I remembered the relentless freezing rain hitting my face like shards of glass. I remembered grinding through 36-hour shifts until my muscles burned and my hands bled inside their thick canvas gloves. I had endured that brutal, punishing isolation because I believed I was constructing an impenetrable fortress for my family. I believed my sacrifice would purchase them a life entirely free from hardship. But standing there with the phone pressed to my ear, I finally grasped the true lesson that freezing ocean had been trying to teach me all those years ago, the day a heavy iron chain on the drilling rig began to rust and weaken under the assault of salt water. We didn't try to save it. We didn't hold on to the corroded metal out of some misplaced sense of loyalty. A compromised link left under pressure will inevitably snap and drag the entire crew into the lethal black water below. You learn the absolute necessity of ruthless excision. You cut the rot away immediately and without hesitation to protect the integrity of what remains. I had failed to apply that cold mechanical logic to my own flesh and blood. I had let the rot of greed and entitlement spread through my daughter until it consumed her entirely. I had held on to the rusted link far too long, and it had nearly dragged my innocent wife into the grave. The woman weeping on the other end of the line was not my child anymore. She was simply the corroded metal I had finally found the will to cut away. Lacey stopped talking to drag in a ragged breath. She waited in the silence for me to offer a solution. She waited for the familiar rescue to begin. I didn't raise my voice. I offered no stern lecture on responsibility or the price of greed. I didn't bring up Clifford or the forged documents or the lethal sedatives. Giving an explanation would suggest we still shared a relationship worth negotiating. I drew a slow, deep breath of the clean pine-scented air. Then I spoke into the phone with a calm, flat, total indifference. I told her she had the wrong number. I didn't wait for her reaction. I pulled the phone from my ear and pressed the red button to end the call. I opened the settings and permanently blocked the unknown number, making certain she could never reach this phone again. The connection was cut, and the quiet of the cabin settled instantly back into place. I set the phone face down on the wooden counter and walked away from it for good. I stepped out onto the wide wraparound porch just as Patty came through the screen door, a soft wool shawl draped over her shoulders against the evening chill. She looked at me with her bright, clear eyes and smiled. She didn't ask who had called. She didn't need to know. The past was no longer welcome inside our home. I walked over and guided her toward the two wooden rocking chairs facing the water. We sat down together side by side. The sun was beginning its slow descent behind the distant tree line, pulling brilliant streaks of purple and gold across the evening sky. The colors laid themselves perfectly across the glassy surface of the lake, a breathtaking mirror of fading light. A cool breeze moved through the pine branches. I reached out and took my wife's warm hand in mine. We sat there together and watched the day come to its quiet, natural end. The order of our world had been fully restored. The long and grinding battle was over. The silence that settled around us was no longer heavy or threaded with dread. It was at last completely peaceful. If you stayed with me all the way to the end, I want you to know I'm grateful for that. This story cost something to tell, and I hope it gave something back in return. I've carried these events for a long time. What Vernon and Patty endured, the slow theft, the poisoning, the silence of a daughter who chose comfort over her own mother's survival. None of it leaves you quickly. But I believe God places moments of absolute clarity in our lives for a reason. The reckoning that came was not about revenge. It was about refusing to let the people who counted on cruelty go on counting on it. That clarity, when it finally arrived, was worth every painful step it took to reach it. Here is what this story taught me, and what I hope it leaves with you. First, loyalty is earned and renewed. A family bond does not entitle anyone to your silence while they destroy you. Second, if someone shows you who they are through their choices, not their words, believe them the first time and act accordingly. Third, protecting yourself is not a betrayal of love. Sometimes cutting the rot away is the only way to save what is still worth saving. Fourth, the quietest form of strength is indifference to someone who wanted to break you. Giving them nothing, no rage, no tears, no negotiation is the final word. If this story moved, you share it with someone who might need to hear it today. And if you haven't already subscribed to Family Revenge Stories, so you don't miss what comes next, leave a comment below. Tell me what part of Vernon's story hit you hardest. I genuinely want to know. Thank you for being here. Take good care of yourself, and I'll see you in the next one.